My wife shamed me over pleasing women at a barbecue. I struck back hard, took back self-respect, and made my toxic marriage face the truth. I detonated my marriage right in front of 20 witnesses at a neighborhood barbecue. And somehow, it was the best decision I ever made. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and cut grass, a perfect late summer evening that promised nothing but easy conversation and cold beers. We were at David and Sarah's, our neighbors, surrounded by familiar faces, the kind of comfortable suburban scene that usually lulls you into a sense of peace. My wife and I, married for 6 years, had slowly drifted into a bizarre dynamic. I wasn't just her husband anymore, I was more like a live-in personal assistant who occasionally shared a bed. I handled everything: the cooking, the cleaning, the finances, the errands, the repairs. And for all that, my reward was constant criticism. I was never quick enough, never quite right. The respect between us had vanished so gradually I hadn't even noticed its absence until it was completely gone. She'd make these little jabs about my bland cooking, or forgetting her favorite coffee creamer, or how I loaded the dishwasher wrong. And I, like an idiot, would just apologize, promising to try harder. I genuinely believed that's what good husbands did: keep the peace, make their wives happy, never rock the boat. I was the guy who'd say sorry even when I didn't know what I was apologizing for, just to end the argument faster. Looking back, it seems pathetic, but then, it was just my normal. So there we were at David and Sarah's, about 10 couples gathered on their back deck. The weather was perfect, the kind of evening where the heat finally breaks, and everything just feels right. I was actually looking forward to it, especially since my wife had been in a decent mood all week. Maybe, just maybe, we could be one of those normal, pleasant couples tonight. I was chatting with a few of the guys about football when I heard a burst of laughter from the other side of the deck where my wife was standing with a group of women and a few husbands. Someone had made a joke about keeping romance alive in marriage, the usual suburban small talk that sounds profound after a couple of drinks but is really just noise. I wasn't really paying attention until my wife's voice sliced through the chatter, loud, clear, and dripping with that specific tone she used when she was about to drop a clever remark. "Maybe my husband should take a class on how to satisfy a woman," she said. You know what I mean? I'll never forget that exact phrasing. The laughter that followed wasn't the good kind. It was that awkward, shocked sound people make when they don't know whether to laugh or pretend they didn't hear. I felt every single pair of eyes on that deck turn toward me, and the burger I'd been chewing suddenly felt like a brick in my mouth. The humiliation was instant, absolute. Here was my wife, the person who was supposed to be my partner, my protector, publicly mocking our intimate life to our neighbors. These were people I'd see at the grocery store, whose kids went to school with the kids on our street, people I'd have to make small talk with for years. And she'd just thrown me under the bus for a cheap laugh. My face burned. That old, familiar instinct flared up: apologize, laugh it off, change the subject, don't make waves. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the beer. Maybe it was the crushing weight of a really long week at work. Or maybe, just maybe, 6 years of accumulated disrespect had finally filled the tank to overflowing. Instead of shrinking, instead of playing along, a cold, clear resolve settled over me. I looked directly at her, and in the same casual, conversational tone she'd used, I said, "That's funny coming from someone who's as dry as toast and dead as a wall." The deck went absolutely silent. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire universe. My wife's smug satisfaction evaporated into pure shock in half a second. Her mouth actually dropped open, but I wasn't finished. I continued in that same calm voice, "But hey, you're definitely an expert at satisfaction since you spend every evening satisfying yourself by scrolling through your phone." The silence that followed was deafening. A couple of people coughed. Someone's beer bottle clinked against the deck railing, and David looked like he desperately wanted to be on another planet. My wife's face had gone from shock to bright red, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes, not sad tears, but furious, humiliated tears. She stood there for maybe 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, then turned and practically ran into David and Sarah's house. I heard a door slam somewhere inside. Sarah gave me a look that was half horrified, half impressed, then followed my wife inside. The guys around me didn't know what to do. One of them clapped me on the shoulder, muttering something about refilling his drink, and the party awkwardly resumed around me, at about half volume. After maybe 10 minutes, my wife stormed back out, her face blotchy, her eyes red. She marched straight up to me and hissed, "We are leaving right now." I looked at her, took a slow sip of my beer, and said, "I'm not ready to leave yet." She actually stammered, like her brain couldn't process that I just told her no. She demanded again that we leave immediately, her voice growing shrill, and I just repeated that I was staying. "You're welcome to walk home if you want," I added, "it's only 3 blocks." The look on her face was pure disbelief, like I'd just spoken to her in ancient Greek. She stood there for another moment, probably waiting for me to cave like I always did, but I just turned back to my conversation with David about the upcoming season. Eventually, she stomped off, and I heard our car start in the driveway a few minutes later. I stayed for another hour, finished my beer, had another burger, and talked about nothing important with guys who were clearly dying to ask what the hell had just happened, but were too polite to bring it up. When I finally walked home, I felt lighter than I had in years. The house was dark, except for the bedroom light upstairs, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing and working herself into a full rage. I made myself a sandwich, grabbed another beer from the fridge, and sat on the couch watching highlights on my phone. She eventually came downstairs like a storm system, and the fight that followed was nuclear. She called me cruel. She called me abusive. She said I'd humiliated her in front of our friends, ruined her reputation, that everyone would think she was a terrible wife. I let her rant for a while, and when she finally paused for breath, I asked her one simple question: "Did you think what you said about me was kind?" She stuttered something about it being just a joke, and I told her I'd been the punchline of her jokes for 6 years now. I'd been criticized, belittled, mocked, and dismissed in private, and apparently now in public, too. And I was done pretending it didn't bother me. Something shifted in me that night. Something fundamental. The old version of myself, the guy who would have spent the car ride home apologizing and the next week trying to make it up to her, that guy was gone. In his place was someone who'd finally remembered that he deserved basic respect, that a marriage was supposed to be a partnership, not a hostage situation. She kept waiting for me to crack, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness like I always did, but I just went to bed. The next morning, she expected me to come crawling back with apologies, flowers, and promises to do better. But instead, I made myself coffee, just 1 cup, and sat on our back porch watching the sunrise. She came out eventually, still in her pajamas, looking exhausted and confused, and asked if we were going to talk about what happened. I told her we could talk when she was ready to acknowledge what she'd done, not just what I'd done in response. She didn't like that answer. She wanted me to be sorry first, to admit I'd crossed a line, to go back to being the guy who absorbed all her crap with a smile. But that guy was dead, and I felt nothing but relief about his passing. I finished my coffee, told her I was going to the gym, and left her standing there on the porch looking like her entire world had just tilted sideways, because it had. The real fun started on Monday morning when I made exactly 1 cup of coffee. Not a pot, not enough for 2 people, just 1 single cup in my travel mug that I took with me to work. My wife came downstairs expecting her usual morning routine where I'd have coffee ready, breakfast made, and her lunch packed, as I had been doing for the past 6 years. Instead, she found an empty coffee pot and me walking out the door with my keys. She called after me, asking where her coffee was, and I just said I made mine and left. I heard her yelling something as I backed out of the driveway, but I had already mentally checked out of caring what she needed from me. That evening, I stopped at the gym on my way home from work, something I hadn't done in years because I'd always rushed home to start dinner. I spent an hour there, took my time in the shower afterward, and didn't get home until almost 7. When I walked in, my wife was standing in the kitchen, looking frustrated and hungry, and she asked when dinner would be ready. I told her I'd already eaten a protein bar after my workout and wasn't hungry, so she should make whatever she wanted. The look on her face was priceless, like I'd just told her the sky was now green. She asked if I was serious, and I said completely serious, then went upstairs to change into comfortable clothes. Over the next few days, I systematically stopped doing everything I'd been doing for her. I did my own laundry and left hers in the basket. I bought groceries for myself and cooked meals for one. I cleaned up only my own dishes and left hers in the sink. I paid the bills that were in my name and told her she needed to handle her car payment and phone bill herself. It wasn't about being petty, even though I know it looked that way. It was about establishing that I was no longer going to play the role of household servant while being treated like garbage. My wife tried everything to get me to fall back into the old pattern. First, she tried sarcasm, making comments about how nice it must be to only think about myself, but I just agreed with her that it was actually pretty nice. Then, she tried picking fights, leaving her dirty dishes right in front of where I was sitting, putting her laundry basket in front of my bedroom door, but I just moved them aside and went about my day. She even tried the silent treatment for about 48 hours, but that honestly just made the house more peaceful, so that backfired on her pretty spectacularly. The breaking point came about a week into my new routine when she opened her closet and realized she had no clean clothes left. She came downstairs where I was making myself breakfast and asked, in this tight, controlled voice, why none of her clothes were clean. I didn't even look up from my eggs when I told her that I do my laundry on Wednesdays and Saturdays and she was welcome to use the washing machine whenever she wanted. She said she didn't know how to use it, which was probably the most honest thing she'd said to me in months. I suggested she check YouTube for tutorials, because that's how I learned to cook half the meals I'd been making for her all these years. That night, I came home from work to find the kitchen filled with smoke and my wife standing over a pot of burnt pasta. Actually burned, black and stuck to the bottom. She'd been trying to make dinner for herself and had apparently forgotten that you need to stir pasta and also not cook it on high heat for 45 minutes. I opened some windows, turned off the stove, and made myself a sandwich while she stood there looking like she might cry. She asked me if I was really not going to help her, and I asked her why she thought she needed help making pasta when she'd been perfectly capable of criticizing how I made it for years. That seemed to shut down that conversation pretty quickly. The laundry situation got even better when she actually tried to wash her clothes herself and somehow turned all her white clothes pink because she threw in a red shirt without checking. She called me at work, actually interrupted my day, to ask what she did wrong, and I told her I was busy and she'd have to figure it out herself. My coworker overheard and gave me this knowing nod, like he'd been exactly where I was at some point in his life. Over the next couple of weeks, my wife's frustration grew exponentially as she realized just how much I'd been doing and how little she knew about running a household. She couldn't figure out which cleaning products went where. She didn't know when bills were due. She didn't know how to meal prep or grocery shop efficiently, and she definitely didn't know how to maintain any kind of routine without someone else doing the mental labor for her. Then her mother got involved, because of course she did. I came home one evening to find my mother-in-law sitting in my living room with my wife, both of them looking at me like I was the defendant in a trial. Her mom started in immediately about how disappointed she was in me, how marriage was about partnership and sacrifice, how her daughter deserved better than this childish behavior. I let her finish her whole speech, then very calmly asked her if she'd raised her daughter to treat her husband like a maid. That stopped her mid-breath. I continued, asking if she'd taught her daughter that it was okay to publicly humiliate her spouse, to contribute nothing to the household, to show zero appreciation for everything being done for her. My mother-in-law started to sputter something about how marriage was complicated, and I agreed completely. I said it was very complicated, which is why I was simplifying it by only being responsible for myself going forward. I asked her who paid the mortgage, who paid for groceries, who cooked every meal, who did every load of laundry, who cleaned every surface, who scheduled every appointment, and who got mocked for all of it. My wife was staring at the floor, and her mother had gone quiet. I told them both that I'd spent 6 years trying to be good enough, trying to anticipate every need, trying to prevent every criticism, and all it got me was a wife who thought so little of me that she'd mock our intimate life at a neighborhood barbecue. My mother-in-law didn't have much to say after that, and she left pretty quickly. But the real intervention came 2 days later when my wife's entire family showed up at our house, her mom, her dad, her sister, even her brother, who I'd met maybe 3 times. All sitting in my living room like some kind of ambush. They wanted to talk about my behavior, about how I was destroying my marriage, about how I needed to be more understanding and compassionate. I listened for about 5 minutes before I stopped them and said we were going to do something different. I turned to my wife and asked her to repeat what she'd said at the barbecue, word for word, in front of her family. She refused, said it wasn't relevant, but I insisted. I told her family that if they wanted to understand why things had changed, they needed to hear what had started it. My wife finally mumbled something close to what she'd said, and I watched her father's face change as he processed his daughter publicly mocking her husband's bedroom performance to their neighbors. Then I asked my wife to tell her family what she contributed to our household, specifically, with details. The silence was deafening. Her sister tried to jump in with something about emotional support, and I asked when exactly that emotional support had happened because I must have missed it between the criticisms and the eye-rolling and the general contempt. I asked my wife when the last time was that she'd cooked me a meal, done anything thoughtful for me, shown any appreciation, or treated me like someone she actually liked rather than someone she was stuck with. She couldn't answer, and her family was starting to look uncomfortable. I told them all something I'd been thinking about for days. I'd forgiven her for the barbecue comment the moment it happened. Forgiveness was easy, but forgetting was impossible, and trust, once broken, didn't just magically repair itself. I said I'd spent years making excuses for her behavior, convincing myself that if I just tried harder, she'd eventually appreciate me. But the barbecue had shown me that no amount of effort would ever be enough because the problem wasn't my performance. It was her lack of respect. Her father, to his credit, asked his daughter directly if what I was saying was true, and she just started crying, not answering, just crying. Her mother tried to comfort her, but her father stopped her and said his daughter needed to answer the question. My wife finally admitted that yes, I did most of the housework. Yes, I paid for most things. Yes, she'd said something cruel at the barbecue, but she claimed she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I asked her how exactly you could mean a comment like that in a good way, and she didn't have an answer for that either. Her family left shortly after, and I could tell from their faces that the intervention hadn't gone the way they'd planned. My wife sat on the couch for a long time after they left, and I made myself dinner, ate it at the table alone, cleaned my dishes, and went upstairs to read. She was still sitting there when I went to bed. And for the first time in weeks, I slept absolutely peacefully because I'd finally stopped caring whether she approved of me or not. And that freedom was worth everything. My wife's breakdown started gradually and then happened all at once, like a dam that develops tiny cracks before the whole thing collapses. She went through every stage of manipulation I'd seen her use over the years, but this time, none of them worked because I'd finally developed immunity to her tactics. First came the tears. Not the angry tears from the barbecue night, but those sad, desperate tears that were supposed to make me feel like a monster for standing my ground. She'd cry in the morning before I left for work. Cry in the evening when I came home. Cry while I was making dinner for myself in the kitchen. I'd just hand her a tissue box and go back to whatever I was doing. Then came the bargaining phase where she suddenly wanted to go to therapy together, wanted to work on us, wanted to start fresh and rebuild what we'd lost. The problem was that she wanted to rebuild it with me doing all the construction work while she supervised and criticized from the sidelines, which was exactly the dynamic that had broken us in the first place. When I told her I wasn't interested in couples therapy because I didn't see a couple worth saving, just two people who'd been living separate lives under the same roof for years, she looked at me like I'd slapped her. She asked what she could do to fix things, what I wanted from her, and I told her the truth, nothing. Because I'd stopped expecting her to give me anything she wasn't capable of giving. That answer seemed to hurt her more than anything else I'd said, and I think it was because she finally realized that indifference was so much worse than anger. The conversation that really ended things happened on a Thursday night about 3 weeks after the family intervention. I was reading a book on the back porch, something I'd been doing most evenings because the house felt suffocating. She came out and sat across from me. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't been sleeping well, and she asked if we could really talk, actually talk, without me shutting down or walking away. I put my book down and told her I was listening. She asked me point blank if what I'd said at the barbecue was true, the dry as toast comment, if that's really how I felt. I looked at her for a long moment and said yes, it was true, but the real question wasn't about our physical intimacy or lack thereof. The real question was what I was willing to tolerate in my life going forward. She didn't understand what I meant, so I explained it to her in the simplest terms I could manage. I told her that I'd spent 6 years trying to be enough for her, trying to anticipate her needs, trying to prevent her complaints, trying to earn her respect through service and dedication. And it had gotten me exactly nowhere. I'd cooked thousands of meals that were too salty or too bland or too something. I'd done thousands of loads of laundry that were folded wrong or sorted wrong or timed wrong. I'd cleaned a house that was never clean enough, paid bills that I never paid early enough, existed in a space where nothing I did mattered because she'd already decided I was inadequate. The barbecue comment wasn't the problem, I told her, it was just the moment when I finally admitted to myself that this wasn't normal. This wasn't what marriage was supposed to feel like, and I deserved better than being someone's verbal punching bag and domestic servant. She started crying again and said she didn't realize she'd been that bad, that she'd just been stressed and took it out on me, that she could change if I gave her a chance. I asked her why I should believe that when she'd had 6 years of chances and had only gotten worse. I told her that respect wasn't something you could fake or force, it was either there or it wasn't. And she clearly didn't respect me as a partner, as a man, or even as a basic human being deserving of kindness. She protested that she did respect me, that she loved me, and I asked her when she'd last shown that love in any meaningful way. She couldn't answer. I told her that love wasn't a feeling you claimed to have, it was actions you consistently took. And her actions had shown me for years that I was worth less to her than the phone she spent every evening staring at. That hit her hard, and she asked if there was any chance we could fix this, if I was willing to try. I looked at her and said the only thing I could honestly say, I was willing to see if she could become someone worthy of partnership, but I wasn't going to wait around hoping for that transformation. I wasn't going to coach her through basic human decency, and I wasn't going to accept breadcrumbs of effort while she expected a feast of gratitude. She asked what that meant practically, and I told her it meant she needed to figure out who she wanted to be as a person, not just as my wife, because the version of herself she'd been showing me wasn't someone I wanted to spend my life with. The final thing I said to her that night became the moment I knew I was completely free from whatever hold she'd had over me. She made one last attempt to turn things around by bringing up the barbecue again, saying that maybe we both needed to learn how to communicate better, how to satisfy each other's needs, trying to make it mutual, like we were both equally responsible for the disaster our marriage had become. I smiled, actually smiled, and told her something I'd been thinking about for days. She'd suggested I take a class on how to satisfy a woman. But I'd actually taken a much more important class over the past few weeks, a class on how to satisfy myself, how to set boundaries, how to recognize my own worth, how to stop seeking approval from someone who was never going to give it. And I'd passed that class with flying colors. I told her that I'd learned I didn't need her permission to be happy, didn't need her validation to feel valuable, and didn't need her approval to make decisions about my own life. I'd spent years making her comfort my priority while my own comfort never even made the list, and I was done with that arrangement. She sat there speechless, and I picked my book back up and continued reading like she wasn't even there. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way our house had never been quiet before. My wife stopped trying to engage me in arguments or conversations or manipulation. She started doing her own laundry, making her own meals, handling her own responsibilities like an actual adult. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me like she was seeing a stranger. And I guess in a way she was, because the man who'd apologized for everything and absorbed all her contempt was gone completely. I didn't hate her, didn't want revenge, didn't even feel particularly angry anymore. I just felt nothing. And that nothing was the most peaceful thing I'd experienced in years. I'd wake up in the morning and make my coffee and go to the gym and go to work and come home and make my dinner and read my book and go to bed. All without once wondering if I was doing enough or being enough or trying enough. I'd stopped playing a game I could never win. And the relief of that was absolutely incredible. My wife had wanted me to take a course on satisfying women. But what I'd actually learned was so much more valuable. I'd learned that the only person's satisfaction I was responsible for was my own. That boundaries weren't cruel, they were essential. and that sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is refuse to accept treatment that makes you feel worthless. I sat on my porch one evening, beer in hand, watching the sunset, completely at peace with wherever my life went from here because for the first time in 6 years, I was truly living it for myself. What would you have done in my shoes?